So I'm very happy to and pleased to have Ruth Ahnert with us today for this third annual Digital Enlightenment Studies lecture. We're really taking a broad view of the Enlightenment in this sense, but that's fine. Ruth is a professor of literary history and digital humanities at Queen Mary, and probably best known, at least in some circles, for her directorship of the Living with Machines project, which was a UKRI big deal for 5 years between the British Library and the Turing Institute, which did all sorts of wonderful things. I'm sure we'll hear a bit about it. She's also worked a lot on the Tudor papers with her partner Sebastian, wonderful book that was out a few years ago, Tudor Networks of Power. And a wonderful little book that I use a lot in teaching, called The Network Turn with Scott Weingart and Nicole Coleman and Sebastian, which I recommend highly, and has done great work for proselytizing network analysis for the humanities, and it's wonderful. So we're very happy to have Ruth here today. Please join me in welcoming her.
And thank you so much to Glenn for inviting me. Today I want to share some work that I'm kind of just completing, although I've been tinkering with it for about 10 years, embarrassingly. So it's a research problem that sits at the intersection of archival studies and early modern history and digital humanities, the problem of aliases. Specifically, I'll be thinking about how we might identify people hidden behind aliases in large-scale correspondence collections, and what happens when we bring computational methods to bear on that challenge. So as you see, the material I work on is the 16th century, so not very Enlightenment. But the methods I'm going to show you today kind of are applicable to correspondence collections of any period. So my argument is that aliases are a natural consequence of communication. So as new communication technologies emerge, so do techniques to evade surveillance. Today we have things like encrypted messaging apps, anonymous browsers and burner phones, but that dynamic is not a new one. So in the early modern period, the technologies were paper and ink, and there were a variety of technologies employed to evade scrutiny, including the alias. Now, while sort of browser technologies have been built for whistleblowers, journalists, and just normal people who want to avoid being surveilled, they're also, of course, used by criminals. And in much the same way, the evidence left in archives shows us that aliases were used for a variety of reasons. They were used by state agents and spies. They were used by conspirators, but also authors and theologians expressing opinions that might have been controversial. Now, intersection of letters was actually a fairly widespread practice in the early modern period. So in a study I did with Rachel Madura and Sebastian Ahnert, my longtime collaborator and partner, we showed that in excess of 5% of papers in the Elizabethan state papers foreign were intercept. So we developed a new method to show this. And that's a lot. And because this was a very real threat for people sending letters, various technologies evolved to protect letters from prying eyes. The most famous histories of conspiracy in this period are littered with those technologies and strategies. We might think of the Babington plot that you probably have heard of, which was the means by which Mary Queen of Scots was ultimately brought down. This was employed encrypted letters, it's sent between aliases, often hidden in beer barrels, and these were intercepted, copied by the double agent Gilbert Gifford, who was also known by various names, and deciphered by Walsingham's codebreaker Thomas Phillips, who we'll hear a bit more about later. Other strategies employed in this period were things like letter locking, which we might think of as a tamper-evident technology. But beyond these dramatic episodes, aliases were a widespread use. And because of that we've come to this method. So for historians, aliases present three kinds of challenge. So there's aliases that actually haven't been solved. The second is aliases that have been identified in scholarship, but for which the information has not been folded back into finding aids, or is not easily discoverable for other scholars. The third is where the identity of the aliases are disputed or theories are difficult to verify. And so what I want to present today is a computational heuristic designed to address these challenges, which I co-developed with Sebastian. The method doesn't solve aliases automatically. I'm not really in the method of kind of automatic methods. Instead, it generates candidate matches that helps guide the historian, allowing them to kind of test and explore and refine hypotheses. We developed this method on the data behind our Tudor networks of power project. So this book applies quantitative network analysis, but also other computational methods to the study of the letters in the Tudor state papers. So these started out as the working papers of the Secretaries of State. They've been catalogued and they were digitized as state papers online. And because if we subscribe to these kinds of resources, we can actually ask for the underlying data. So we asked for the underlying data, the XML and the scans, and from that we extracted 132,747 letters, which were from and to over 20,000 people spread across Europe and beyond. But that kind of quick overview of the data belies what was a long and arduous data cleaning process, 18 months probably. We first needed to clean people's names. We needed to disambiguate them and deduplicate them. We needed to do the same for place names. We also enriched the data. We sort of geocoded the places. We added linked data to people. So in the book, we have an interactive visualization. Now, aliases were part of that data cleaning process. And we might think of aliases as a kind of advanced deduplication problem, because people are known by multiple names designed to avoid being collapsed onto one identity. And we can see exactly the kind of problem that poses for us with the visualization in this next figure. So this is a network visualization of the different aliases that have been attributed with different levels of controversy to a man called William Sterrel. And I'm going to come back to this tricky character later in the talk. But what you need to know now is that all of the yellow nodes have been suggested as aliases of Sterrel. And if they were collapsed, the network would look like this. But they have not. This shows you exactly what aliases do. They have the function of breaking connections in a network, obscuring identities and creating dead ends, not only for anyone surveilling the letter writers, but also for any historians later working with those archives. And here at the sort of leftmost two little, they're called dyads, where you've got an entity with two nodes connected with one edge. They're the kind of perfect case. What's happening here is the aliases are used so strictly that they are directional as well. That person A writing to person B is probably using a different alias for person than person B writing to person A. If you use a system like this perfectly, it's very, very, very difficult to collapse it back into the kind of network I just showed you. But fortunately, people are lazy, people make mistakes. And so once we can start piecing together little bits of evidence to start collapsing the network together, this is where our method comes in. So that network visualization of Sterrel's aliases and neighbours showed us the problem. But networks also offer a solution through the method of quantitative network analysis. And so the idea behind our heuristic is if X communicates with Y and X communicates with Z, but Y and Z do not communicate, it is possible they are the same person. And this builds on a theory by Granovetter. It's like his standout publication. It's like massively cited. It's called The Strength of Weak Ties. But in that publication, he has something called the Forbidden Triad. And he says that if X and Y correspond, and no, sorry, that's the wrong bit. If X has strong social ties with Y and Z, there will also be some kind of social tie, either weak or strong, between Y and Z. And he describes social networks where there is an absence of the Y-Z tie as the forbidden triad, precisely because it deviates from observed patterns in social network data. So we're kind of riffing on that theory. So for those of you who might be familiar with the state papers or other kinds of state collections, you might be thinking of reasons why there wouldn't be connections between Y and Z, precisely because this started out as the Secretaries of State's papers. You might think of the Secretary of State as the X node. That's true, but the state papers also folded in all sorts of other administrative packets. And and it did lots of interception. It seized lots of people's private correspondence, meaning that very frequently we find that triads are in fact closed. So open triads are a clue to us, and that's where we begin. So this is how the method works. So the method, very simply put, systematically searches for open triads amongst the 20,000 plus nodes. Now we developed two variants of this method because we have kind of different alias problems that we know about or might be looking for. So the first one begins with a designated identity that's a suspected alias, something like an initial or a symbol. And this returns us a single list of people that fulfill the criteria, that is, pairs of correspondence that are unconnected but which share neighbours. We've also developed a second variant, which is a kind of more exploratory research tool, which might begin with a given person in the network who's known to correspond with people who might have used aliases. And what we do is we scour their entire neighbourhood for people who fulfil that criteria, i.e. people who share neighbours but don't correspond with one another. And what that gives us is a list of pairs of nodes to explore. What we then need to do is verify all of those candidates. And as this description shows, the method is necessarily a very quite simple heuristic. The suggested matches for each candidate can often be numerous, especially around secretaries of state. But when trying to make matches where evidence is uncertain and indeed designated to evade scrutiny, it is better to have lots of false negatives and to find a few positive matches amongst them. So that's why we kind of designed it as that kind of open net kind of approach. And as I've suggested, a crucial step in this methodology, therefore, is verification. So each candidate has to be checked by one, of course, and compose as many puzzles as answers. In some cases, the identity can be verified by handwriting, by endorsements, where internal information acts as a giveaway, and also we might look to contextual information where we know that a given person was in a given place at a certain time and makes it likely that they would have had access to that knowledge. And as I've suggested, this method works best on regions of the network that have small information hubs, so people like diplomats, more minor secretaries, agents, and known conspirators. As I'll discuss in the next few minutes, when dealing with agents associated with a principal secretary, the method often presents us hundreds of candidates, which take longer to work through, but still is useful. In all cases, what this method does is it makes tractable something that is a very, very large and complex problem and actually makes it navigable for users. So let's begin looking at the method in action. Sprinkled through the state papers are tantalising letters in which the senders or recipients are identified by initials, symbols, or vaguely described as an intelligencer or spy. Many of these figures, unsurprisingly, sit within the orbit of principal secretaries, channeling sensitive political and military information. Yet it's precisely the proximity to power that makes aliases used in these contexts so difficult to unravel. So the nature of the challenge becomes clear when we look at a few examples. And it's quite good to show you where there has been a proposal in scholarship because it allows us to kind of test a hypothesis. And specifically one we're using here is one that hasn't been folded back into the finding aid. So in the state papers, it looks like a separate identity. So in the case of PH, the method returns us 704 candidates, so that's quite a lot. But crucially, it does include Robert Barnard, who's already proposed in scholarship. And that identification is strengthened by handwriting comparison with an earlier letter signed by Barnard and by what we know of his career. He also operated under other aliases, so it'd be things like Robert Wood. And he was a double agent working for Walsingham and is known through the Babington plot. Now, it makes a useful case for testing the method. It shows us that the method can return us the right answer, but amongst a lot of candidates. And we can narrow this by looking at kind of narrowing by temporal window, which often narrows things down to something like 20 or 40 matches instead. But it does also show us the power of the alias, how you can hide in plain sight because of the crowd that's around you. Now, while aliases used in correspondence with secretaries often generate daunting candidate lists, the method gives us much more tractable candidate lists when applied to cases connected to less prolific correspondence, but often still gives us some plausible answers. And so there's a couple of examples we have here. We have the case of NB, which was either not been solved or not is very difficult to discover in scholarship. He wrote to Thomas Philippes in 1584. We get 18 candidates back, including Thomas Barnes, and we find an endorsement to B, and we know that Philippes often used that to signify Barnes. Another example is HB, which is slightly more tentative, but I think is still the correct response. He wrote to William Davidson, who was the agent in the Netherlands. He was the diplomat in the Netherlands in this period. And among the candidates, I think it was exactly 100 candidates actually, we find Nicholas Brunick. And this is very possible because he sent Davison 2 letters in roughly the same period. It's similarly written in French. It has a very comparable hand, though not identical. And the way that Brunick styles his N is very like an H. So this feels like a feasible match. Now, the payoff of resolving such aliases lies in what it allows us to see. Once identities are consolidated in a network topology previously fractured and obscured, it becomes legible and for us to understand the full scope of a person's contacts, reach, and access to knowledge. And sometimes this also exposes a different side of a figure that we thought we knew. One such case is the alias 8D8. So here we get a really huge candidate list, but fortunately I found what I thought was the solution within the first 100. And this is on the basis of handwriting and then finding a valediction that was identical to the one used by Jacques Lellier. And so to our knowledge, this hasn't been identified before. And it gives us new information about Dupin's covert diplomacy. What makes this case particularly interesting is that Dupin is not one of Walsingham's shadowy intelligencers. He was, in fact, Secretary of State to Henry of Navarre. So earlier the same year, 1588, Dupin had written openly to both Walsingham and Burghley seeking support for Navarre during the Eighth War of Religion, which was fought over the right to the French throne. And the letter from the 8D8 alias is markedly different from those earlier letters from Dupin. We might think of it as kind of quite oblique. It's sort of hard to understand the meaning, as the catalogue editor dramatically writes, "If I understand this dark letter aright, it points out the measures for keeping the King of Navarre constant to the Protestant party." So it's quite hard to see what's being said. It is kind of hidden. And it's very clear that Dupin is not acting in his capacity as the Secretary of State anymore. Rather, he's actually coordinating with a foreign power to manage intense pressure on Navarre to convert to Catholicism in order to secure the throne. And we know that he did ultimately convert to Catholicism in 1593. But this letter from the 8D8 alias suggests that there were already reasons to suspect that he would convert back in 1588, thereby frustrating plans for a European Protestant coalition. And so we can see exactly why he might choose an alias. He wants to protect himself. His actions may have been perceived as disloyal to Navarre. He also wants to protect the Protestant alliance, as information about Navarre's feared conversion could have risked their relationship with their existing allies or have been leveraged by their enemies. But of course, aliases were not only used by agents of the state, but also as adversaries. Elizabeth I faced repeated plots from Catholics against her position on the throne, both at home and abroad during her reign. And while these conspiratorial networks have been extensively studied, many aliases to which they've operated remain unresolved or disputed. And the method provides a kind of systematic way of intervening in these debates. So I don't want to spend the whole talk kind of showing you piecemeal, like we've solved this alias and we've solved this alias. But there's a couple of examples here that show what's useful about the method in particular. It's worth showing, again, the method where we find, for example, symbols and people just given initials. We find among those likely matches. So we've got an example of F here is probably Thomas Fitzherbert. Slightly more tentatively, we think MA should be mapped to Hugh Owen. And this is consequential because they were both important leaders within the Catholic exile community in this period. Fitzherbert was, of course, active in the cause of Mary Queen of Scots. And then we're going to come back to Hugh Owen later, but he was a very kind of important information hub in the funneling of information between Spain and England in the 1590s especially. And by resolving these aliases, we expand the information we have about these men. And once again, we're verifying it through handwriting, letter form signatures, letter contents. You know, in one of them, we've got information about Gilbert Gifford's arrest in Paris. And we know from contextual information that Fitzherbert was in Paris at that time and would have access to that knowledge. But I also want to bring up an example of a case where we could not find a match because it's an instructive case. So we have the case of FV. And he, this was used in a single letter to address Charles Paget. It came with 22 candidates, but it was not possible to decisively match any of these. The letter is a copy, so we can't rely on handwriting, as other contextual clues are lacking. But the candidate list itself, those 22 names, were revealing because they showed us two important things. Firstly, it shows us that the FV letter was likely to have been part of an intercepted packet because it occurs, two of the other candidate matches, WB and Moore, were sent within a 3-day window. So it was likely they're part of an intercept packet. And also two further candidate matches, Chaumont and Martin, have already been identified in scholarship but not folded back into state papers online as aliases of Thomas Barnes. So what it's showing us is even without a firm identification, we're seeing something about the community dynamics around Charles Paget, the recipient of this letter. But in so doing, it also shows us why the second variant of our method may be more useful for thinking about conspirator networks. So just to remind you of what's different about the second variant, it casts a wider net. So if you begin with a single person, you can cast the net in their entire community around them. Anybody who they correspond with who may have been an alias. And that's really good because it doesn't require us to know in advance which names are aliases, because some aliases are not symbols and initials, as in the case of Chaumont and Martin. Barnes's pseudonyms don't announce themselves as aliases. And it helps us to uncover things like letter bundling and things like that. Which brings us to the case of William Sterrell, with which we started with that figure, that network diagram. Sterrell's case illustrates how profoundly alias attribution can reshape historical interpretation. Depending on which identities are mapped onto him, Sterrell appears either as a minor and perhaps not very efficient conspirator, intelligencer, or perhaps someone actually working actively with Catholic conspirators, following Patrick Martin and John Finnis's suggestions. He was a man managing multiple personae, and our method provides a systematic way of testing these competing interpretations. So was he an ineffectual intelligencer, or was he actually conspiring with the Catholics he was reporting against? So this started out as part of the Earl of Essex shadow foreign office. So he, in the 1590s, he wanted to set himself up as a successor to Walsingham. And it was designed as an independent intelligence operation with Francis Bacon, designed to interpret, shape and redirect information circling amongst Catholic exiles. And central to this endeavour were Thomas Philippes and William Sterrell, whose coordinated use of aliases created such a massive puzzle for us working now. Now, the strategy they developed was straightforward in conception, but sophisticated in execution. Sterrell would pose as an agent sympathetic to Catholic exiles in Flanders, feeding them false intelligence reports, while reporting back emerging plots against Elizabeth. So this plan built on Sterrell's existing contacts in the Netherlands, particularly amongst figures already suspected of involvement in intelligence gathering and conspiracy, including Stanley, Holt, Sherwood, Owen, Fitzherbert, and a figure known as Captain Jakes. So to appreciate the stealth of this operation and the difficulties it poses for modern reconstruction, it's necessary not to map not just a single correspondence network, but multiple overlapping networks associated with the aliases used by Sterrell which are all listed here with various levels of scholarly backing. Our method, of course, does not work on this series of three dyads I'm talking about here. But once we start collapsing the network, this is when the method comes into its own. So fortunately, the archive itself preserves traces of how their system operated, and therefore some of the aliases have already been noticed by the editors of the calendars of the state papers. So for instance, names have been scrubbed and replaced, so this allows us to map the sterile name to Henry Saint-Main. We have a few endorsements on letters left by Philippe's. For example, there's a letter sent by Franklin, which is endorsed by Philippe's to Saint-Main. And we also have palaeographical evidence which suggests that Harry Witcham could be confirmed through the handwriting comparison with the Saint-Main identity. So this is an alias that's long been associated with them, and we can kind of confidently say that these are all the same men operating under the same, under different names. And what becomes clear by looking at these is that the aliases were not randomly divided, they were relational. For example, the alias sterile was the name used for Philippe's internal records. That's why he's endorsing Saint-Main, sterile. The name that he was given in the exile community by comparison was Robinson. Either that's how he was known or that's how he instructed that community to call him. And letters from the Robinson alias were sent to not Philippe's but to Morris. So Philippe's there was operating under the Morris name. So in other words, identity was carefully segmented by audience and sometimes even by direction of communication. Now, more complex is the identity of Peter Hallins. So while traditionally this has been attributed solely to Philippe's, Martin and Finnis have argued that Hallins actually functioned as a shared or composite identity used collaboratively both by Sterile and Philippe's. Now, there's good evidence that Sterile and Philippe's did in fact operate shared aliases. So the Witcham name, for example, which was used by Sterile for outgoing letters in 1602 only, was also used as what we might think of as a kind of inbox or like something like a post office box years earlier. The Hallins alias appears to have operated in a similar way, being used primarily for incoming correspondence in the period 1597 to 1602. It's never used as an outgoing alias. But unlike Witcham, Hallins had this kind of fully realised persona. He was a merchant, a coopman from London, and different contacts wrote to it. But the two different hands likely managed it, although to the outside world it seemed like one single coherent persona. So from these securely identified aliases, we've been able to map down Robinson, Saint-Main, Witcham, Franklin and Hallins to a single node there. So we get this consolidated network at the top. And we see already how Sterile is a small information hub. We've also collapsed Philippe's to the aliases of Morris, Witcham and Hallins. But we still have these challenges down the bottom. Also based on the testimony of Philippe's, we have also collapsed down a couple of aliases on Hugh Owen. We know that he was Pettit, that he also used the Thomas Nichols and W. Nichols aliases. So this is a partially collapsed network based on material evidence. However, it's important to note that these verified identities, for the most part, only cover incoming correspondence to Sterile and Philippe's. And Philippe's testimony given in 1603 in response to accusations of conspiracy with Owen, note that Owen believed that the correspondence travelling in the opposite direction to come from a friend of Sterile's. But under what name were they written? No letters from Hallins are outgoing. And this is where we come to the more contested examples. Martin and Finnis have argued that further aliases such as Fenner, Cordale and Vincent Orwell and even Anthony Rivers should be attributed to Sterile. And so this matters because Rivers actually appears in the historical record as someone who is regarded as very crucial to Catholic networks. And specifically, he's got his own ODMB entry. Sterile does not have an ODMB entry. So this is consequential. So if this is correct, this would radically recast Sterile, not as a marginal or ineffective intelligencer, but as a figure deeply embedded in Catholic strategy. And so this is Martin and Finis's kind of big argument. His apparent failures may have been calculated to in fact serve the exile community. Now, our purpose in engaging with this claim is twofold. First, to test whether the method supports these identifications, and second, to see whether collapsing these aliases onto a single node enables further discoveries. Now, we can justify a second round of consolidation using two pieces of evidence. Firstly, our method predicts that Cordale could in fact be Fenner. And you can see that if you imagine sort of diagonally folding this figure onto the yellow, you can see how that would work, that they could be the same person because they have no contacts. Secondly, the handwriting. I think it's absolutely, sorry, these are from State Papers Online, so they're horrible quality, but I think it's very clear that this letter by Fenner is in the same hand as this letter by Cordale and this letter by Rivers. And I think looking at all of the letters by these guys and the hand and the layout, the format and the way in which they encode the date, we can definitely say that Fenner, Cordale and Rivers are the same person. But is that cluster of aliases the same as the sterile cluster of aliases? If we can match one, then we can prove that they were all the same person. So the decisive evidence, I should have said, the really important thing is that the handwriting of these letters looks nothing like the sterile aliases. But that isn't damning evidence in itself, because we can see that Sterile wrote in several hands. We don't see him writing in this hand, but we see him writing in several hands. He was able to disguise his handwriting. The evidence that cinches it, though, is a little detail. And it might seem like a little detail. It's about gloves. So, in a letter sent to Sterile and Philippe's under the Hallin's alias, in a letter sent to Sterile and Philippe's under their Hallin's alias, Owen, under his Petter alias, requests that some sample gloves be copied and made up into 24 pairs. So I sent my host in Antwerp, unto whom I give you charge to deliver my letters to the post, 2 gloves of sundry sort to be sent unto you, praying you to cause to be made of each fashion 12 pairs, and of the like leather. So later that month, we have what looks like a reply, a letter sent under a different alias, Fenner, to Picciolo and Edlino. And we think it's a reply because he says, I have bespoken your gloves, but they are not yet ready. That would mean that Fenner potentially is Hallin's, and Picciolo or Edlino is Pettit. We think the latter. Later that month, again, Cordale, another alias again, writes to Balthazar Geibel saying, I wrote to you and Edlin for Brussels, like for bed, and I shall expect it. And by the next opportunity, I hope to send Edlin 24 pair of gloves according to his pattern. So it's a little detail, but I think these are the links in the chain that show that Hallin's is Fenner, is Cordale, which means that Anthony Rivers is also William Sterile. As an aside, I don't think these are real gloves. I think that the gloves are a coded reference, probably to manuscript texts for scribal publication. That seems the most likely interpretation. And leaving them unbuttered, I think, means leaving them unbound. So once we collapse the sterile identities and rerun the method, something important happens. New candidate matches emerge. And now these can be solved iteratively. And thus what began as a set of isolated puzzles become a dynamic process of reconstruction. And I don't want to go through things in details, but I think from this work, we're able to suggest several new clusters and several new matches. So, for example, for Hugh Owen, we've already collapsed him with Pettit and Nichols, but we then can suggest additional matches, Edlino and the canon, which are almost certain and already suggested in scholarship. But also, we want to suggest a couple more matches that aren't suggested yet, which might be Jean Leclerc and Carhart. We have an alternate proposal for Carhart as well, which might be Derrick, which has already been proposed as an alias of Richard Sherwood. We also suggest a cluster of aliases, Gant, South and Geibels, are likely Richard Verstegen. It doesn't suggest Richard Verstegen as a match because he was actually really, really good at keeping his aliases separate, but Gantz, South and Geibels are definitely the same person, the handwriting's the same. And it shows the intermediary role that Verstegen had in funneling information to Brussels and to Rome. We have a further bundle. We think that Crilato Picciolo and Giuseppe Tusinger are William Baldwin, and Marco Tusinger and Nokiko are Robert Persons, and they were two very important leaders in the Catholic exile community. And finally, we have this figure of Galdelli, who we think is separate from all of these other people, but has an intermediary role like Verstegen, and it could be either Derek Sherwood or Francis Harvey, who was a merchant in the Netherlands. So we've made lots of proposals today, and taken together, I hope these select examples show how the method is useful for solving aliases and mapping possible theories. But it's not just about solving a set of archival puzzles. The method also helps to make visible the operational logic of secrecy itself. Seen from this broader perspective, the proliferation of aliases appears less as a series of ad hoc disguises than as a series of strategies. And these strategies and trends come into focus gradually through the case studies, but could be summarised as follows. The agents and conspirators commonly maintain multiple identities, that these were tailored to different relationships. The incoming and outgoing correspondence was often separated across different pseudonyms to make it really difficult to reconstruct. Handwriting was sometimes disguised. Aliases might be shared or collaboratively maintained. Secure management of intelligence sometimes required individuals to hide additional identities from their collaborators. And some aliases function something like a post office box. Letters directed to single aliases might in fact be redistributed through intermediaries like Verstegen. And this infrastructure often invited the bundling of letters into packets. And these kind of strategies, strategies like this kind of use of post office box meant that maybe people who were more peripheral in the network, maybe not at its centre and might not be entirely trusted, couldn't reconstruct the entire path that communication was taken. So it was a useful strategy. But more broadly, by showing how our method unfolds in practice, I hope I've also shown the value of computational heuristics for this kind of historical research. Computational methods should never be substitutes, of course, for archival expertise. And here we show how archival skills and knowledge in the history of the period are absolutely crucial for verifying candidates. But the number of newly solved aliases and new hypotheses would not have been possible without this method because of the way it renders the search for candidates more tractable. Its value is not just the way that it may lead us to new matches, but also the way it allows us to explore and test hypotheses and counterfactual accounts of history. I'd like to close by pointing out that this method is agnostic. It wasn't developed. It was developed for the state papers, but would work on any kind of correspondence data set that is not an ego network. So that isn't just one person and their contacts. It has to have those kind of alter connections between them. But it's also not just limited to solving aliases. As I said at the beginning, aliases are what we might think of as an advanced deduplication issue. So you could use this as a method for data cleaning and to finding those duplicate entities in your data sets. But it's also, I've got Howard Hodson here today, it's also been used on the Networking Archives project to look at other community-based reasons that people might not be corresponding with one another, maybe because they were actually avoiding corresponding with one another. So my main takeaway is that I hope that other people will find this heuristic useful and pick it up for their own applications. So finally, I'd just like to thank, again, my collaborator, Sebastian, to our funders. This came out of the Tudor Networks of Power project funded by the HSC. And thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.